Never before have world and domestic trade and economics and diplomacy and politics and the class struggle generally been so deeply intertwined. And right here in the US, we are in the thick of it. Any illusion people had of stability, of nice, easy, steady progress under capitalism, it's been totally shattered. Everyone here in this room knows what we need to do to get out of this societal dead end. We need to build a disciplined organization of a few thousand Marxist cadre as a stepping stone to a mass revolutionary party. And we know that getting there is going to take a lot of energy, a lot of hard work, and a fair amount of time. But we need more than that. We need political clarity, sharp perspectives, and a firm grasp of the fundamentals. And that's what the draft documents and the discussions at this Congress aim to achieve. Now, the most simple and yet at the same time the most complex and profound ideas are actually the fundamentals because everything else flows from them. So we need to return to them over and over and continually refine our command of these ideas. So what exactly do we mean by the fundamentals? Well, first and foremost, we mean the fundamentals of Marxism. Marxism, of course, it represents the distilled essence, the historical memory, and the generalized experience of humanity as a whole and of the working class in particular. Of course, the truth is concrete, and theory is only useful insofar as it helps us identify and connect the essential dots of dynamic reality in a systematic and an efficient way. Obviously, we can't predict the future with absolute precision, but through a series of successive approximations guided by Marxist theory, we can triangulate our understanding of events so that we can then intervene in them. And that's the whole point of perspectives. Now, the fundamentals also refers to the fundamental processes that are unfolding in the world around us, in the economy, in politics, and how all of this impacts mass consciousness and the rhythm of the class struggle. Capitalism is historically exhausted as a force for human progress. Only by abolishing the nation state, private ownership of the means of production, and the market economy can we unleash humanity's full potential. And this is the root cause of the accelerating crisis being faced by US imperialism. This is what explains Trump's apparent effort to reorient US imperialism back to its home region, the Americas, though he hasn't been particularly successful so far. Because there's a ferocious debate raging over what America first really means. Does it mean that America remains the unrivaled hegemon worldwide as it was after the fall of the Soviet Union? Or does it mean that it should focus more on its more limited national interests by retrenching to the Western Hemisphere, rebuilding its industrial strength, and giving up on being the world's policeman? Now, all of this has led to huge divisions in the ruling class, and it's accompanied by deeply distorted social and political polarization. Now, all of this has been thrown into a high-power blender, and the rolling political and constitutional crises flow from the economic crisis and vice versa. This isn't just any crisis. This is an organic, systemic, existential crisis of capitalism and the regime of bourgeois rule. The knives are out as the main imperialist powers try to export crisis and unemployment to their rivals so that they can stave off social unrest at home. And not everyone can win this game, so the capitalists are determined to make their enemies pay and, of course, to make the working class pay. But it doesn't have to be this way. The objective conditions for building a world of socialist plenty are beyond rotten ripe. But unfortunately, the lack of a revolutionary leadership worthy of the name has delayed the socialist revolution for many decades, and this in turn has exacerbated all the inherent contradictions of the system. Now, the absence of a mass workers' party, it means that process of political clarification and of building such a force, a class-independent force that's capable of leading the working class to power, that's going to be protracted and non-linear. And that's pretty much it. I mean, there's a lot more to it, but that's it in a nutshell. That's the situation we're dealing with. That's the core of the perspectives. It's an incredibly tangled mess, and at any moment, the whole thing could spiral out of control. And the historic task of the RCA is to help humanity bring order out of this chaos. Through the socialist revolution, a workers' government, and a rationally planned economy, linked up through a socialist federation of the Americas and the world, That's our aim. Now, we've drawn these conclusions based on a very careful and thorough analysis of these processes, and we've illuminated it all with a whole bunch of facts and figures. We didn't cherry pick the data to fit a predetermined outcome. That's not Marxists. And of course, it's not just the Marxists that are saying that everything is trending towards disaster. As we've seen, the serious bourgeois press is also full of doom and pessimism. They can see that Attila the Hun is at the gates and they have nowhere left to run. And if Attila doesn't break in and string them up, their own populations are going to do it for them. So they're increasingly desperate. The idea of American exceptionalism, which was already riding high after World War II, was put on steroids after the fall of the Soviet Union. And imposing a liberal version of capitalism on the rest of the world with a steady stream of profits flowing back to the US became an obsession. So to maintain their position of unquestioned dominance, they had to prevent any serious rivals from emerging. Now, this was clearly outlined in a national security strategy paper that was written back in 1988. And it said, the United States' most basic national security interest would be endangered if a hostile state or group of states were to dominate the Eurasian landmass, that area of the globe often referred to as the world heartland. We fought 2 world wars to prevent this from occurring. Now, if you fast forward 37 years, it's clear that their efforts to prevent that from happening have been a catastrophic failure. Through their arrogance, they've pushed Russia and China together, and they're facing a major strategic defeat in Ukraine. They didn't foresee China's meteoric rise as a major world power, nor did they take seriously the rise of things like BRICS or ASEAN or the GCC or other alternatives to US-dominated globalization. And now they're short-circuiting, and very few of them are able to accept or recognize or admit this new reality. Now, one of them who is able, appears able to accept this and admit it, is none other than J.D. Vance. Now, just last week, he gave the commencement speech at the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis, and he was extremely blunt in his assessment of the situation. So I think it's worth reading a little bit of what he said, because it shows just how correct our analysis of the situation has been since long before Trump and Vance came into the White House. So he said, we had a long experiment in our foreign policy that traded national defense and the maintenance of our alliances for nation building and meddling in foreign countries' affairs. Even when those foreign countries had very little to do with core American interests. What we're seeing from President Trump is a generational shift in policy with profound implications. Now, following the collapse of the Soviet Union, our policymakers assumed that American primacy on the world stage was guaranteed. For a brief time, we were a superpower without any peer, nor did we believe any foreign nation could possibly rise to compete with the United States of America. And so our leaders traded hard power for soft power. We stopped making things, everything from cars to computers to weapons of war, like the ships that guard our waters and the weapons that you will use in the future. Why did we do that? Well, too many of us believed that economic integration would naturally lead to peace by making countries like the People's Republic of China more like the United States. Over time, we were told the world would converge toward a uniform set of bland, secular, universal ideals, regardless of culture or country. And those that didn't want to converge, well, our policymakers would make it their goal to force them by any means necessary. So instead of devoting our energies to responding to the rise of near-peer competitors like China, our leaders pursued what they assumed would be easy jobs for the world preeminent superpower. The Trump administration has reversed course. We're returning to a strategy grounded in realism and protecting our core national interests. The era of uncontested U.S. dominance is over. Now, that's not JP saying that. That's JD saying that, the Vice President of the United States. But I have to say, it seems that Trump doesn't seem to have gotten the memo because he's all over the place. You know, sometimes he echoes Vance. At other times, he acts like it's still the 90s and that the U.S. is still the undisputed king of the cage. And talk is cheap. He can say whatever he wants, but actions speak louder than words. And Trump could have ended the flow of military, economic, and intelligence assistance to Ukraine when he came into office, but he didn't. He could have stopped the genocide in Gaza and brought Netanyahu to heel and cut off the weapons, but he didn't. He could have come to a rational agreement with Iran over its nuclear energy program, but he hasn't so far. Maybe he'll get to that. But you never know. He could have calmly renegotiated terms of trade with Mexico, Canada, China, and the rest of the world, but he didn't. Instead, he tariffed everybody willy-nilly and threatened to invade or annex Greenland, Canada, and the Panama Canal. So obviously, changing course so drastically is easier said than done. But the stakes are incredibly huge, and there's a lot of wealth and power at stake, and there's intense resistance to any of this from the neocon liberal establishment. Nonetheless, just saying this stuff really represents a huge shift and has huge ramifications, including psychological ones. By every measure, the US remains a superpower, but it's just not quite so super anymore. Imperialist domination, it's predicated on economic domination. And as that part of the equation has trended downward, so has everything else. For 500 years, capitalist Western Europe and its American offshoot dominated the globe, and the Mediterranean world, which was the center of world history for a very long time, was supplanted by the Atlantic. But that broad historical era is over. And just as Trotsky predicted, the Pacific is becoming the world's economic center of gravity. And I'd add to that the Indian Ocean and the Arctic as extensions of that core, which includes about 60% of the world's population. Now, one recent example of this waning power of U.S. imperialism was its confrontation with Ansar Allah, also known as the Houthis in Yemen. After losing 2 or 3 F-18s and $1 billion worth of drones, bombs, and missiles, all they achieved was to kill a few hundred civilians. An entire U.S. aircraft carrier group was forced to abandon its defense of Israel, which is why it was there, and exit the Red Sea with its tail between its legs. Now, Yemen is one of the poorest countries in the world. It has a per capita, per person income of just $1,000 per year. Now, just imagine if the U.S. had picked a fight with a real power like Russia or China or even Iran, who have much more advanced capabilities. So here's the question: has the decline of U.S. imperialism reached the point of no return? It's hard to say. As we said earlier, these things are processes. Now, in my personal view, I think the tipping point on the military front came with the launch of the Russians' Oreshnik hypersonic missile last year on November 24th. And I think you could make a good case to say that that's the day that U.S. imperialism lost the arms race. As far as economic domination, I think April 2nd, so-called Liberation Day, is a pretty good candidate. Trump thought the whole world would come to him on bended knee. They'd kiss the ring, starting with China, and that's not quite what happened. Trump ended up folding pretty quickly. It's not an accident that Mao's phrase, paper tiger, to describe the U.S. has seen a big revival in China and other parts of the world. Or that Wall Street has come up with a new acronym that really pisses Trump off, and it's TACO. Have you heard of TACO economics? Trump always chickens out. And if you know anything about Trump, that is, the absolute worst thing you could say to this guy. Now, it's only with the benefit of 20/20 hindsight that we'll be able to say for sure that a tipping point has been reached. But dialectics shows us that eventually things turn into their opposite. A classic example, and again, we sometimes say, if you can't explain these ideas to a 6-year-old or an 8-year-old, then you don't really understand them well yourself. So a good example is if you cut down a tree, is it still a forest? Okay. And then you cut another. Is it still a forest? And another. And another. And another. And you keep on going, and eventually, all you have to do is cut one last tree, and there's no more forest. So the point is, wherever we're at on this process, we do need a sense of urgency, but I would say of patient urgency when it comes to building the RCA. We have to recognize that it takes time to develop cadre and leadership teams, but we also have to understand that we don't have all the time in the world. Hubris brings down every empire, and the United States will be no different. If American capitalism can't deliver like it used to, then the American working class ain't going to behave like it used to. It's that simple, and that's what we're preparing for. Now, as we've explained, capitalist globalization, dominated by the US, is what drove world economic development for a whole historical period. And of course, a harmonious division of world labor makes a lot of sense from the point of view of efficiency and productivity. But capitalism, it's also based on nation states, on markets, on private ownership of the means of production, and cutthroat competition. So it's not as simple as just planning everything in the interests of everybody. That's not how the system works. Now, when the United States ruled the roost, it wrote all the rules in its own favor and expected everybody to obey them. But now that there's some serious competition, it's threatening to take its ball and to go home. But the problem is there's a lot of other balls, or a few other balls out there, and a majority of the world is no longer interested in caving to the demands of a whiny, spoiled brat. And the trade war, it's a blatant attempt at extortion to try to keep that unipolar party going. And this was clearly stated in a really astonishing document that was published by the White House just after so-called Liberation Day. And it basically argued, or argues, it's still on the website, that the rest of the world should be grateful to the US for being its overlord. And that everyone should help in the burden of propping up the indispensable nation, as Madeleine Albright described the US. And this is what it says. What forms can that burden sharing take? There are many options. Here are a few ideas. First, countries can accept tariffs on their exports to the United States without retaliation, providing revenue to the US Treasury. Retaliation will exacerbate rather than improve the distribution of burdens and make it even more difficult for us to finance global public goods. Second, they can stop unfair and harmful trading practices by opening their markets and buying more from America. Third, they can boost defense spending and procurement from the US, buying more US-made goods and taking the strain off our service members and creating jobs here. Fourth, they can invest in and install factories in America. They won't face tariffs if they make their stuff in this country. And fifth, they could simply write checks to the US Treasury. I'm not making it up. You can look it up. You know, when the Japanese delegation came to Washington to try to make a deal, the Trump team basically asked them, well, how much are you willing to pay? And since they weren't about to bid on their own humiliation and indentured servitude, they just hopped back on the next plane to Tokyo. After coming out guns blazing and assuring everybody that the tariffs were permanent, the US blinked first, and the world definitely took notice. Because whether it likes it or not, a multipolar, or if you prefer, a multinodal world is being imposed on US imperialism. But this only means that we've returned to a world of competing great powers. Imperialism hasn't been ended, not by a long shot. It's just no longer super concentrated in one country. Now, Fred talked a little bit about the concert of Europe, and multipolarity isn't anything new. It's more or less the way the world was organized for centuries after the Peace of Westphalia was signed in 1648. Now, modern Chinese imperialism, for the moment at least, may be more focused on the export of finance capital and cheap commodities than on military intervention. And modern Russian imperialism may be focused mainly on on securing its own borders. But you can't have imperialism without exploitation and oppression. It's still imperialism. And when push comes to shove, you can't have imperialism without military and economic violence. The reality is that the Chinese have effectively become better capitalists than the Americans. And the irony is that they're the ones defending the World Trade Organization and demanding that the rules be followed when that was created by the US to defend its interests. Now, we've explained in many places how the Chinese bureaucracy, using the deformed worker state and its planned economy, which was established by the Chinese Revolution, they were able to use this as a launching pad for capitalist restoration and industrial development. And in effect, they compressed this centuries-long process of capitalist development in places like Britain or the US into just a few decades. And of course, it required, and it still requires, extreme brutality, merciless pressure on the Chinese working class, and they will have something to say about all of this before things are said and done. We just saw, for example, a big strike by BYD workers, thousands of BYD workers. But in any case, when the U.S. started, exporting all this capital and factories and everything to China, they thought it was a win-win. They got super profits due to the low wages and the bad working conditions and bad environmental protections that they had in China. Plus, they got cheap commodities for American consumers so that they could drive down real wages here at home. Of course, in the process, they deindustrialized the country and they laid waste to hundreds of working-class cities and towns. Now, to tamp down all that anger that was building up, they unleashed a flood of opioids and leaned on right populism and xenophobia to distract and divide through the so-called culture war. So the claim that the Chinese stole American jobs, it's just absurd. In one form or another, those millions of jobs were outsourced in the name of profit by the American capitalists. But in any case, with this confrontation, the Chinese have been preparing for something like this for years. They've worked over the last 8 years or so to establish new markets, new partnerships, new trade routes, and new diplomatic connections all around the world. We've seen how tariffs on Chinese goods and sanctions on Russia, they actually pushed them closer together and accelerated the evolution and the expansion of this BRICS formation. Now, China, in its preparation for this, it's issued in 2015 a 10-year plan, a strategic plan. They called it China 2025 to transform the country's manufacturing sector from low cost to high-tech innovation. And within just 8 years, and a 10-year plan in 8 years, more or less, they hit it. China, by 2023, they led the world in 57 out of 64 critical technologies, and the U.S. only had the edge in 7. Now, Thomas Friedman, he's a columnist from the New York Times, and he's no fan of China. But he recently visited Huawei's new research center, which is roughly the size of 225 football fields. And afterwards, he wrote an article called, "I Just Saw the Future. It Was Not in America." Now, Foxconn's factory in Shenzhen is reported to have as many as 450,000 workers. The biggest factory in the U.S. is the Boeing plant in Washington, which has about 30,000 workers. Now, it's not just tech for civilian purposes. The Chinese state is also preparing for a military confrontation if it comes to that with the United States. So, for example, they're building the world's largest military command center, which will be 10 times bigger than the Pentagon. I mean, the scale of this stuff is just nuts, isn't it? But the point is that building military industrial power requires a lot more than just advanced technology. You do need that, but you also need lots of natural resources, you need lots of energy, and last but not least, you need a skilled workforce. But because of the state of the United States and the way capitalism has neglected its population for so long, only 40% of Americans can read above a 6th grade level. According to the OECD, China, by the year 2030, 5 years from now, China will have 37% of the world's STEM workforce. That's what science, technology, engineering, and math, right? 37% of these sort of more advanced degrees in China, 26% in India, 4.5% in Russia, and the US will have just 4.2%. Now, in 2023, China's manufacturing labor force was 162 million strong. The whole of NATO, including the US and all of Western Europe and most of Eastern Europe, their entire manufacturing labor force is just 60 million. So, I mean, the scale of this just dwarfs what the West has been reduced to. Another example: ship making capacity. We talked about the number of ships that the Chinese can build versus the U.S. in the document, but to run those ships, the U.S. has fewer than 10,000 commercial sailors left, whereas China has 2 million. China also has a 90% monopoly on rare earth mineral processing, and that also puts it in a pretty good bargaining position. They have basically, as far as I understand, they've still banned the export of these things to the US, and pretty quickly you're going to see the crunch when it comes to producing electronics. Now, None of this is to glorify Chinese or any other non-US imperialism. Just because our main enemy is at home doesn't mean we support other imperialist powers. But this is the new reality, and it marks a colossal change in the situation. China has plenty of weaknesses of its own contradictions. It's facing an enormous, constant crisis of overproduction or a situation of overproduction. But the point is this: China might not be able to win a trade war with the US outright, but it's confident that it can wait things out longer, that it will lose less as a result. I mean, it's better to have docks and warehouses full of unsold commodities than empty shelves and higher prices at the local Walmart. Trump is terrified of ending up like Herbert Hoover and of being blamed for a new Great Depression. And the Chinese, on the other hand, they've referenced the century of humiliation which China suffered at the hands of the West in the 19th and 20th centuries. And Xi Jinping has been able to whip up Chinese nationalism, which gives him a little bit of leeway. Now, all that being said, it's a dysfunctional marriage, but it's a marriage nonetheless. These economies are really deeply connected, and a total divorce would be very painful for both sides. China doesn't want, it's not like it wants the U.S. economy to implode. It's still an important market. It owns hundreds of billions of dollars in U.S. Treasury bonds, and if the dollar collapses, they lose that. And of course, the shockwaves of a U.S. collapse would reverberate across the whole planet. So we'll have to see what happens. You know, just when you think they're dialing things back, now it's 50% on Europe, and then 50% on steel now and stuff. But the point is, it's still unresolved, and it's already started to backfire on Trump. As one analyst put it, it's a short-term play to solve a long-term structural economic problem. And ordinary Americans will be made to eat the tariffs, and they're not going to be happy about it. I mean, after all, Trump was given a second chance in large part because he said he would eliminate inflation, not add to it further. So if you look at the gas prices at the gas pump, they haven't risen much, but that's only because there's a big fall in demand because there's no confidence in the future. But you better believe that some serious inflation is in the pipeline as all of this works its way through the supply chains. Now, part of our task as Marxists is to recognize and generalize patterns in history, in the economy, in the class struggle, and in politics. But it's pretty hard to find any consistent patterns with Donald J. Trump, other than his consistent inconsistency. And there's usually more madness than method in his reality TV show. I mean, every day it's just like I was telling someone it's an insult to circuses to call what's happening a circus, because circuses are actually very well organized and they're very skilled. Now, some people, they claim he's a genius. You know, he's playing 4D chess, and he's a master of strategic uncertainty, which is, other people think that he's merely an irrational man-child. I think it's a bit of both. Because just when you think he's got to have some kind of something up his sleeve, right? This has to be going somewhere, and then you just realize that he's just flailing about and more or less making it up as he goes along. Now, all that being said, in a deeper historical sense, and in an extremely distorted way, I think we should emphasize, his effort to remake America in his image, it's a recognition that the capitalist neoconservative liberalism that dominated for several decades, it's just hit a brick wall. But the so-called deep state, which we've characterized very carefully in the document, it is deeply entrenched and it is resisting. Now, over the last few decades, these neocons, they built a really formidable permanent administrative apparatus, as Steve Bannon called it. And so I think in the next period, this dogfight at the top, it's only going to get uglier and uglier. But we should, again, always remember that all of these people are staunch defenders of capitalism and of imperialism. And since Trump isn't about to abolish capitalism, he's basically just trying to rearrange the deck chairs on the Titanic. And the only way to prevent the ship from hitting the iceberg is for the passengers and the crew to get organized, overthrow the officers, throw them overboard, and take command of the ship themselves. There's just no other way to put it. U.S. imperialism, it's living on borrowed time. It can't project the power it once did because its economic foundations are fundamentally unsound. Let's start with the national debt. which currently stands at nearly $37 trillion. And every 3 months, another $1 trillion is being added to that. Now, along with funding the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, this amount that's been built up, I think there was a balanced budget. There was no deficit under Clinton. Just like 25, 30 years ago, in that short span, they've added all this debt. And it's because they had these wars. And then, of course, both parties, administrations of both parties, they've kept taxes on the billionaires low and military spending high. So to make ends meet, the government has to keep on borrowing new money to pay off the debts that they made earlier, that they took in earlier, plus interest. So in 2024, last year, the government had to borrow $1.8 trillion to cover the difference between income and expenses. Like about a third of the total budget they had to borrow. Now, interest payments alone, just interest, amounted to $1 trillion, which is more than the entire military budget. But it's basically a legal Ponzi scheme. You know, when there aren't enough new investors to pay back those who got in earlier, then the whole house of cards could collapse literally from one day to the next. And the United States, the biggest, most powerful country on earth, could literally go bankrupt and default on its debts. And that's why, for the first time in history, all three credit rating agencies have downgraded the U.S.'s sovereign credit rating from AAA, from AAA to AA+. Now, that might not sound like much, but it does matter. And why? Why does it matter? It matters for the same reason your personal credit report matters. If people start doubting your ability to repay your loans, they'll charge higher interest to make up for the increased risk, or they'll stop lending you money altogether. So it might only be a minor downgrade for now, but the fact that it's happening at all to the world's biggest economy is, again, a big deal. Financial markets tend to be extremely efficient. They're ruthless. I mean, after all, maximum efficiency in the pursuit of profit is their lifeblood. But the verdict is in. The markets, and especially the bond markets, are not impressed with Trump's policies, including his tariffs or his big, beautiful bill. Now, the bulk of the national debt, it's held in the form of U.S. Treasury bonds, which have always been seen, or for a very long time, as a safe haven investment. After all, what could be more stable, reliable, and trustworthy than the U.S. federal government? Well, you seem to have your doubts. Well, many domestic and foreign lenders are also not so sure about this. So instead of parking their money in U.S. Treasuries, they're buying real estate, armaments, precious metals, and crypto. And again, this marks a huge shift. The U.S. dollar has been the world's de facto reserve currency since at least the 1920s. But of course, the U.S. has abused that position in many ways. So just to give a couple examples, there's a thing called SWIFT, which is the global messaging system that allows banks to trade money between different countries across borders. But the U.S. has used that to monitor trade and to enforce sanctions on countries like Iran and Russia. When the Ukraine war started, the U.S. and its allies, its Western allies, they froze about $300 billion in U.S. central bank assets that they had deposited in their jurisdictions. That's roughly the equivalent of the GDP of Finland. That's basically been hijacked from Russia. Now, that's a big amount of money, and billions of dollars have accumulated in interest on those deposits. Some of that interest has been expropriated and given to the Ukrainians so that they can fight the Russians. So, instead of greasing the wheels of world trade, these tools, the dollar, SWIFT, everything, they've been weaponized to undermine U.S. imperialism's rivals. And so the so-called rules-based international order, it's more like the Wild West, where the U.S. makes up the rules as it goes along. And so this has, of course, led to the rise of alternative interbank systems like BRICS Pay, it's called, or just direct exchanges between countries in their local currencies. So that's why we're now talking about de-dollarization. And again, it's an almost entirely self-inflicted wound. The bond market works like this. When demand is high, people want bonds because the risk is considered low, then the interest rates are also low and the government has to pay less in interest. But when demand is low because the risk is considered higher, then the interest rates rise and the government has to pay more. So when the trade war started, Trump assumed that all this uncertainty would sort of stampede people into buying good old safe treasury bonds, which would then lower the interest rates on that $1 trillion interest that they have to pay every year, and that would help them save some money. But that's not what happened. Instead, people started selling those bonds off. The Japanese started selling a bunch of bonds, and they're the biggest U.S. Treasury holders. After so many zigs and zags and so many threats, they just simply couldn't trust the United States anymore. So Trump had to back down very quickly. Now his so-called big, beautiful bill, that's projected to add another $3.8 trillion to the deficit. That would bring the debt to GDP ratio to its highest level since 1790. Not 1970, 1790. I mean, that's crazy. Basically, since the Bill of Rights was adopted. And so some people have called this bill, it's a road to nowhere. It might pad his reputation a little bit for the rest of his term, but it won't actually reindustrialize the country or enrich the majority, which is what he promised. If you look at the details, it's actually yet another cash grab and a net transfer of wealth from the many to the few. So, where's the money going to come from for future spending and debt servicing? There's only a few alternatives. They can print more money, they can borrow more money, they can raise taxes, or they can cut spending. Now, inflation has already been spiked by what they called fiscal stimulus and quantitative easing, which is basically just printing money and putting it into the economy. So they're not likely to do that again in the short term, although I would bet at a certain stage they're going to have to do that anyway because they'll have no alternatives. Now, raising taxes obviously is a no-go politically, so something else is going to have to go, and that means that the very few remaining social nets that we have in this country are on the chopping block. But that's not going to be enough to have the savings, so they're going to have to borrow even more money and pay even more interest after all, which is all going to further aggravate their problems. Now, Trump likes to be liked. He acts tough, but he's actually, they say, apparently he's a bit of a softie because he's so insecure, and he doesn't, he likes to offend people, but not too much, and he certainly doesn't like to be offended. But he tries to pose as a populist, despite being a billionaire real estate and casino, a failed one, by the way, developer from New York. I think he declared bankruptcy 6 times. But anyway, he promised that he wouldn't touch Medicaid, and he even floated mild taxes a couple weeks ago on the ultra-rich. But this new budget would cut $1 trillion from Medicaid and food stamps over the next decade. Now, given the lack of quality jobs and universal health care, more than 71 million Americans or people are enrolled in Medicaid, and roughly 42 million receive food stamps, including millions and millions of Trump supporters. And at the same time, after promising to end all the bloat and the corruption and bringing in Elon Musk and Doge and all this stuff, the military budget is going to top $1 trillion for the first time in history, which even Elon Musk thinks it's not the best idea. But the other angle of this is that $1 trillion doesn't buy you what it used to. So it's the most amount, but because of inflation, they're not even going to get as much as they would like to get out of that money. The Department of Defense, with all its military bases and all its airplanes and ships and all that kind of stuff, the Department of Defense, it owns over 70% of the nation's assets. Our public wealth, 70% of it is owned by the Department of Defense, and it can't account for half of it. They've never passed an audit. They just don't know where this stuff is. And so this is the cynical double standard when it comes to government spending. They just pour money into the black hole of so-called defense while they humiliate old people, they stomp on poor people, and they cut their benefits to the bone. Over the last few decades, life has gotten worse for the majority, and the wealth gap has exploded. I think we all know this one. The richest 1% of Americans now own nearly as much as the bottom 90%. That's 5 times more than it was 5 decades ago. In just the last year, the 10 richest Americans collectively got $365 billion richer. That means that each of them made an average of $100 million every single day. Now, the average American worker makes about $50,000, so it would take a median wage American worker only about 730,000 years to make an equivalent amount. And now these people are going to get another tax break. So you better believe that American workers are deeply anxious about the future. It's been 17 years now since the Great Recession of 2008, and American workers still haven't recovered. And under capitalism, they never will. Consumer sentiment, it's plunged in recent weeks. It's fallen out to the second lowest level since 1952. And according to the pollsters, the decline was pervasive and unanimous across age, income, education, geographic region, and political affiliation. Millions of Americans, they're out of cash. They've tapped out their credit lines. 59% of Americans don't have enough savings to cover a $1,000 emergency expense. Last year, 30% of Americans used a buy now, pay later service. And 30 million Americans had to hawk their valuables at one of the country's 11,000 pawn shops. 60% of households and 82% of individuals can't afford to buy a car in the country that, you know, is known for cars. I mean, it's part of the American dream, part of the American spirit. Now 82% of individuals can't afford to even buy one. And this is at a time of near record employment. Unemployment is at near record lows. But even if you have a job, pretty much everybody hates their jobs. A recent study found that 81% of 18 to 24-year-olds and 83% of 25 to 34-year-olds are suffering burnout from their jobs. But you know, don't forget, these are the good times, comrades. These are the good times. And the next recession, maybe it started by now, but technically it hasn't officially started yet. And while inflation is the main problem right now, some analysts worry that the economy could slip into a deflationary debt spiral. I mean, none of us can even imagine what's about to come. It's only the beginning. And the capitalist war on American workers' wages, conditions, and quality of life is only going to intensify. Because austerity, unlike anything American workers have ever seen, is the only way that the capitalists can get out of this mess. They're coming after Social Security. They're coming after Medicaid, Medicare, food stamps, housing assistance, and anything else. And all of those cuts, they're going to have a cascading effect throughout the rest of the economy and throughout the rest of the working class. All those jobs and businesses that are supported by that money. And this is the essence of the crisis of the regime. But they have no alternative but to risk the explosion of the class struggle through these attacks. Now, we talked about the dollar a little bit already, but I want to go just a little bit deeper. So if the dollar is strong in relation to other currencies, it means that the U.S. can buy more goods denominated in other currencies. It also makes U.S. debt more attractive, right? Because you get more for the U.S. But a strong dollar makes your goods more expensive for other countries to buy. So a strong dollar is good for imports, but it's bad for exports. So Trump wants a weak dollar on the one hand to help export more, and a strong dollar to help with imports. But this is one of those cases where it's not a unity and interpenetration of opposites. You just cannot have both of these things at the same time. And the value of the dollar as a general currency, it also affects wages and purchasing power. Capitalism, it's a global system, obviously, and therefore competition over wages is also global. As it happens, rates for manufacturing labor in India are currently 3% the rate in the United States. So instead of paying an American worker $100 to do a particular job, the capitalists only have to pay an Indian worker $3. In China, it's 20%, so they have to pay $20 instead of $100 to an American. And to make the dollar truly competitive and to really retrench and really rebuild industry and everything, some economists calculate that the dollar would have to be devalued by 90%. In other words, instead of paying $100 for an American worker to produce something, they would pay them just $10. That's the direction this is going, comrades. Wage stagnation, yeah, that sucks. Creeping inflation, that sucks. Gradually losing your social services, that sucks. People will grumble, they'll complain, but they'll put up with it for longer than you might think. But cutting your effective wages by 90%, do you think the American working class is just going to roll over and take these kinds of attacks indefinitely? Well, the bitter truth, that this is the truth. This is what's coming. A tsunami of layoffs, of home foreclosures, of defaults on car payments, on credit cards, on student loans. It's all in the pipeline. And this is not what people had in mind when Trump promised them a new golden age. They've adopted a wait-and-see approach for one president after another, but they've already seen a lot, and they're not going to wait forever. For decades, I'm sure you talked to your parents. They played by the rules. They did it the way they were supposed to. They got this education. They took out the debt. They bought the house, blah, blah, blah. But we've gotten nothing in return. And eventually, as they did in the summer of 2020 after the murder of George Floyd, they will move to seize their destiny in their hands. And all of this turmoil has big political repercussions. It's impossible to quantify it exactly, just how much the mood has changed in the last few years, but I'm sure we all have anecdotal evidence of this from our recent interventions and our recruitment stalls. Trump, he may have won a clear victory in 2024, but he was by no means given a unanimous mandate. The warmongering Democrats were so hated and corrupt that they lost the election as much as Trump won it. Now, he hit the ground running and he flooded the zone, but he's already getting sucked into that swamp. And a lot of the voters who helped put him over the electoral edge, they've already turned on him, and it's only been a few months, He has the lowest ratings of any president at this stage of the presidency. And yet there's 3.5 more years of this yet to come, or maybe more if you listen to Steve Bannon, if you believe Steve Bannon. Now, speaking of Bannon, we might laugh about this guy. He's a total reactionary, but he's also extremely intelligent. He's intense, and he's a student of history and human behavior. And in his own twisted way, he's kind of trying to build a reactionary version of Bolshevism for the far right. And in some ways, that's going to be a big part of our competition when it comes to winning over angry workers who are looking for a radical solution. And we've got to step up our efforts to match those people's intensity and dedication to their cause. Now, as we have explained, the only realistic way for the Democrats to try to regain some relevance in the short term is to adopt some kind of left populism. And a tiny sliver of them have moved in that direction. We've seen Bernie Sanders and AOC with the Fighting Oligarchy tour. But the Democrats are a bourgeois party through and through. And the last thing they want is to unleash the raw anger and the power of the masses. That's the last thing they want. So most of them, including presidential hopefuls like Gavin Newsom, they're actually moving further to the so-called center, which in bourgeois politics means further and further to the right. So while Trumpism may be losing a little momentum, there's nothing yet that can replace it. There's this huge vacuum on the left. And I think despite how pathetic AOC and Sanders are, we probably will inevitably at some stage see some form of reformism, because that's just part of the learning process of the masses as we march towards revolution. As for the question of fascism and Trump's semi-Bonapartist tendencies, what is clear is that the ruling class can't rule in the old way, but it can't impose a dictatorship either, even though there's people that think we should go back to a monarchy, and apparently that's trending, bring back the king, But they can't impose a dictatorship, certainly not in the short term, and this is above all because of the social weight of the working class, as well, I think, in part, of its actual belief in these ideals of democracy and freedom. So, we've had several near misses when it comes to a constitutional crisis, but eventually there's going to be a direct hit on this thing. It's only a matter of time before there's a serious clash that calls into question the entire system of checks and balances. So you have the capitalists losing control of their political parties. Their institutions are increasingly distrusted and hated. And absolutely nothing has been resolved, not since 2000, not since 2020. It's often the case that when they want to fight, when the masses can't find a way out on the political front, they turn to the economic or industrial front. Both parties have failed them several times, and economic hellfire is about to rain on the workers. So we are certain to see an uptick in labor struggles at a certain stage, even if many workers are kind of in shock at the beginning of this onslaught. It's not possible, of course, to predict the timing, rhythm, or intensity of the class struggle, but we will eventually see a revival of that great American tradition of factory occupations. And we have to keep a very close eye on the labor movement. We'll have a discussion on the trade union work tomorrow, so I won't say much more about that. But if we are going to skillfully intervene in labor struggles as they arise, we need to be sharp and fluent with our program. We have a program and a mini version in the back of the paper, not just for kicks. We really need to understand this thing backwards and forwards, in particular the points, for example, on nationalization and workers' control, and linking that with these concrete struggles as we participate in them. There's also the question of immigration. That's just another massive powder keg. Whether it explodes here or it explodes in a Latin American country, we have to keep an eye on this because revolutions do not respect borders. And anything that happens in any other country in the world that's in a revolutionary direction is a big step forward for our work here in the US. Now, comrades, did any of you just randomly decide you wanted to dedicate your life to the socialist revolution? It's a process, right? And I think we all had our own road in joining this historic movement. And although the details surely varied, obviously, I bet there was a common thread linking all of your reasons. You've all heard of the social contract, right? It's the idea that a population agrees to give up some of its autonomy and freedom in exchange for allowing the state to protect everybody's collective interests. As the Declaration of Independence says, governments are instituted among men and everybody else, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. But how can anybody possibly pretend that the current U.S. government defends the interests of the majority? Without a shadow of a doubt, this is a government of, by, and for the billionaires. But the Declaration has more to say, and by the way, it was drafted just a couple of blocks from here. We're right in the area where all this stuff happened, where the first American Revolution, was basically born. Very exciting, but it has this to say about government. Whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. In other words, comrades, the most inalienable right of all is the right to make a revolution. Now look, capitalism, it's had 200 years to prove that it can deliver safety and happiness for all, and it has utterly failed. So there's a lot more I'd like to say, but I think I've covered most of the main points. I think the main conclusion of our perspectives is that capitalism has dug itself into a hole that it can never get out of. Last year, world debt totaled $318 trillion, which brings the global debt to GDP ratio to a record high of 328%. That means that every worker on the planet would have to work for more than 3 years without consuming anything just to pay back those parasites. Does that sound like a rational system to you? It's simply unsustainable at every level. And if we look back to history, we see that debt and that an economic crisis accompanies almost every major revolution in history, and that is where we're going. And I even had time to mention the wildfires, the flooding, the climate crisis. There's so much combustible material in the US and around the world that just about anything could set off a major crisis or movement. Now, 5 years ago today, the George Floyd uprising was raging in 2,000 cities and towns across this country. That was 5 years ago today that was happening. Think about where you were at that moment. That was a watershed moment in the history of this country, a glimpse of revolution and proof that things like that can happen in the citadel of world imperialism. It's also a reminder that you can never tell which spark is going to set off a generalized conflagration. So the point of perspectives isn't to achieve absolute precision. It's about getting a handle on the broad trends and the general processes. We're clear on the fact that as long as capitalism continues, all roads lead to rising misery, class struggle, and polarization. But we know that those same roads also lead to a revolutionary explosion and an almighty effort to overthrow American capitalism once and for all. And that is what we're preparing here, comrades. How many of you are a little bit stressed out by what's going on around the world right now? Be honest, Look, that's perfectly understandable, okay? But you know what? This is what an epoch of revolution and counter-revolution looks like, comrades. You only live once, and I'd much rather live in interesting times than in boring times. I may already be in my early 50s, but I plan on seeing the socialist revolution in my lifetime. So, it might be stressful every now and then, but it's an absolute privilege to get to live in times like these. And it's an even bigger privilege to be a part of the RCI. Not just because we have Marxist theory and perspectives, which allows us to understand what the hell is happening, but because we also have the methods of Bolshevism, which are proven to work by historical experience. Now, looking out, this is an amazing view from up here, comrades. I wish you could all have this view. Some of you will. But looking out at the sea of intelligent, engaged, determined faces, it's 100% clear to me that we are on the right path. So we should be absolutely confident in our perspectives, our ideas, our organization, and above all, the power of the working class. So how many of you are ready to fight? Well, the fighting spirit, you can't teach the fighting spirit, actually. We all have a little bit of a fighting spirit, but we have to confront those fears and we have to get ready to fight. But as Trotsky wrote during the Civil War in Russia in 1921, he said, one must have the desire to fight not for the mere sake of fighting. A great historic goal is indispensable. And we, comrades, have the greatest historic goal of all time: to win genuine freedom for everyone and to unleash the full potential of our species to build a paradise here on Earth. And despite the many confusions and convulsions, history and the working class are on our side. Class independence and the ideas of Marxism are our compass, comrades. Society can't stagnate indefinitely. Sooner or later, it either falls backwards or leaps forward. Backwards lies the end of human civilization as we know it. And forward lies the revolution and the socialist transformation, the transition to a classless, moneyless, stateless communism. And come hell or high water, that's the direction the RCA is headed.